Welcome to another episode of Earthly Show and Tell. Today, Josh Gilman, the SRE lead at IOHK, that's Input Output, will take us on a deep dive into how his team has used Earthly to transform their CI. If you're not currently using Earthly, this is still interesting because Josh covers some of the challenges and solutions to working with a monorepo, including caching. So without further ado, take it away, Josh.
All right, so this is just an informal video kind of demoing how we do CI at our company using Earthly. My team started using Earthly probably sometime around the midpoint of the year, and we've been very happy customers ever since. The development team really fell in love with it pretty quickly. And so about a month ago, I took the time to build a kind of a more robust CI system that uses GitHub Actions as well as Earthly underneath the hood to try to, improve the developer experience even more than Earthly was already improving it. And so I'm just going to kind of give a quick overview. There's a lot here, way more than for me to cover in a single video. It would be multiple hours. So I'm going to summarize where I can and just highlight the points that I think Earthly, really shown the brightest in. So the way that this works in a nutshell is basically there is a CI pipeline that uses a discovery method to basically discover all of the Earth files in a given repository. Now, we like to use monorepos here. Most of our services are, or most of our teams share a single monorepo. Not all of our teams, but I mean, each team has all of their services in a single monorepo. So that's the style that we have. And so one of the problems that we were trying to solve early on in CI was trying to reduce the barrier of trying to add a new project into the CI system. If you're just manually defining everything, then you got to know what knobs to turn and where to configure things in order to get the project to be picked up correctly. And so the thought process I had was, if we're using Earthly, then it's very likely that each project has an Earth file in it, or potentially multiple Earth files in it. And at the end of the day, all we really care about is our Earthly targets being executed. And so the thought process was, let's come up with a discovery mechanism that basically just looks for Earth files, compiles them all together, or compiles a list of them all together, and then passes that off to the CI and says, go build all of these. And that's basically how this whole system was born. So if I pull up the documentation, and I'll throw links so you guys can look at all of this yourselves, but there we go. So this is basically what it looks like. So the ideal is that, when you're trying to create a CI system, you want to be flexible, but you also want to be opinionated. The flexibility comes from, you don't want to make it so hard that the developer can't build their project, or they have to resort to all sorts of hacks in order to build their project. And I think Earthly itself is kind of the flexibility layer. At the end of the day, all you really need to define for our CI system is an Earthly target. And so an Earthly target can do a number of things. Now, the way you do those things and the way you output things, we do have some opinions around what that should look like. But for the most part, you're free to just run whatever commands you need. So there's flexibility there. But in a larger scale, in terms of like how the whole system operates, it's very opinionated. And the way that we did this is we basically just broke it up into phases. And so, here is just our interpretation of how CI should run. Now, obviously, people could do this completely differently, but what we have is basically a check phase, which is where you run things like static analysis, linting, spell checking, anything that doesn't require building code should go into the check phase. It's supposed to be executed very quickly, very lightly, and it's the first in line, so that if there's something easy like a linter error or a formatting error, it just rejects it immediately before going into the next step, which is a lot heavier, which is actually building. And so building is exactly that. It could be building a Go binary, it could be packaging something with Python. It just really depends on the language that you're using. But the ideal is whatever artifact that you're trying to produce in your project, this is the place that you build it. Package is kind of an interesting step that we introduced after we kind of made this whole thing, because what we found is that sometimes there are packages, if that's what you want to call them, or maybe projects that actually have dependencies on multiple different Earthly targets. So for example, we may have a web service that has a server and a CLI bundled together in the same container image, but the web server and the CLI are technically two different projects, right? So in the build step, the CLI would build in one step and the web server would build in the next, and the package step would actually package those two together into a container image. And as the package step is running, it's utilizing, of course, the caching that was achieved in the build step. So this tends to be a pretty quick step. And then finally, testing is testing, right? This could be unit testing, integration testing. Sometimes I see unit testing happen back here. We're not too much of a stickler about it, but definitely integration testing happens here. Once everything's been built and packaged, then we just use Earthly with something like the Docker integration of being able to spin up like a Docker Compose environment and do all of our integrations tests. And then finally, we do release and publishing. The difference between these two is releasing is for releasing artifacts to GitHub releases. So like, for example, a binary, like a CLI or something that should just be released by itself. Publishing is publishing containers to a container registry. So sometimes a project may release and publish at the same time. Like if it's a CLI, perhaps they release the actual raw binary, but they also publish a container for people who like to use containers. Whereas a lot of our microservices themselves are just meant to be run in a containerized environment. So they don't have a release. They just do a publish. So what this looks like in Earthly is basically all of these are just targets. And so what happens is when the CI starts up, it calls a custom written CLI, which basically just uses the Earthly AST to basically just go and search Earth files and parse them to fetch all of their targets. And then it looks for a specific target depending on what phase it's in. So if we're in the check phase, it's going to look in Earth files and find check targets. Now, not every project has to have a check target. If there's no check targets, like literally the entire repository has no check targets, it just skips the whole job and moves on. However, what it does allow is maybe some projects do have a check target and some don't. The ones that do, the CI will automatically go out and find them, find the target, and then execute the target. And so the benefit here is that the developer doesn't need to be aware of what's happening. From their perspective, they can simply just add this thing called an Earth file that looks very much like a Docker file into the root of their project, define a check target, and then write, all of the code that they want to either do linting or formatting or whatever. And when they commit that, they can be, certain that the CI is going to find that and run it and automatically, fail if that check target happens to fail. And so their integration point with the CI happens at the Earth file. And so essentially what we've done is we've turned the Earth file into the developer interface with the CI system. And that really is the bottom line of the entire system. Like that's kind of how I designed it from the beginning. I wanted it to be able to be out of the way. So I didn't want developers having to touch GitHub Actions YAML or some weird files, configuration files kind of laid out all across the repository. I really wanted them to have a consistent experience no matter what repo they were in, no matter what project they were working in. They know that if they want to interact with the CI system, all they have to do is just define this Earth file, write their whatever targets they need to consume, and then just fill in the blanks. And so that was really, like I said, kind of the goal here. And I think what it ultimately, I guess in the end, it ultimately was really well received. The developers absolutely fell in love with it. The ideal that they didn't have to worry about any of this GitHub Action stuff anymore. The fact that Earthly was very familiar to them because of the Docker syntax, so they could just get right in with writing all of their CI code just as if it was a Docker container, but then not have to worry about all the extra steps because, of course, behind the scenes, I'm an SRE, so I'm doing things like image scanning and supply chain validations, right? Like I'm doing all sorts of stuff. They're not aware of any of that. All I really care that they provide is tell me how to validate your project, test it, build it, and make the container image, and then the CI automatically pushes it to container registry. Our GitOps operator pulls it off, the container registry and deploys it. All that stuff kind of happens behind the scene. And really all the developer sees is just this sort of, magical, in a sense, Earth file. And so, behind the scenes, like if you want to look kind of at a particular example, let's go look at an action. You can kind of see that's not the one. Let's look at, see if we can find. I don't somebody is working on a project and has everything is failing. So let me see if I can find a. There we go. All right, take a look at this one. So this is kind of what it looks like in, a high level overview. So you can see there's this discover step, and it does the discovery step each time. I definitely have a lot of improvements. I built this entire thing in about 2.5 weeks. So it's definitely a prototype. I mean, it does work really well, but there's some room for improvement. One of them is just doing the discovery once. But right now, it just does the discovery every phase. And here you can see it's basically discovering. This is right here. This is the CLI, the custom CLI that I built. It's just written in Go. Like I said, consumes the earthly AST, and it's just doing a scan. So it's looking for all the earth files in this repository, and specifically, it's looking for -T. Meaning any earth files that have the check target, and so then what happens is that then gets passed into a matrix, and as you can see, and this is another thing I need to improve. The pathing here is really ugly, but if you look at these individually, every single one of these is an earth file. So home runner, catalyst CI, actions, discover. So if you look in this folder, there's an earth file at the root of this folder. So this is actually just the path to where the earth file exists. And so what it is it basically just multiplexes. And so every single one of these individual jobs, these GitHub action jobs, are basically calling earthly. Now we use remote satellites. So, if you actually look at what's happening, you'll see, right here, we're using build kit host and passing a remote runner. So you can see it connecting there. So, these typically run very fast. I mean, it looks like this one finished in 5 seconds. So, you can see everything's cached, right? And so it's generally pretty fast. What we found is that, especially when you're running like 10 jobs, if you go the alternative route and you just, compile all of your earthly targets into like a single target and then call that target, so that earthly is, basically building multiple targets at the same time. What we found is that the network coming back was really slow. And I don't know if it's just GitHub Actions that starts throttling you at a certain point. But what we found is if we multiplexed into separate jobs, everything completed a lot faster, even though it's using the same remote runner. And like I said, our thought process there, without really like digging into the details, is that a majority of it was just around network and the bandwidth of pushing the images back to the container runner, the GitHub runner. And so, yeah, I mean, most of the jobs just look at the same thing. They're just, again, discovering and then multiplexing, discovering and then multiplexing. Things get a little more interesting over here in like the publish and release. I'm not going to go too much details. You can look at them yourself if you want. But basically, what we're doing here is there's a custom GitHub action that is actually running earthly. So I don't know if we can see when you do like build image, it's calling this this catalyst CI actions run. So this is a custom action right here. And basically it's a TypeScript based action. And really all it's doing underneath the hood is just executing earthly. It's got kind of a nice UI to it. It sort of breaks down the earthly command into a little bit more bite-sized pieces. So you specify your earth file, your target, a platform that you want to build on, an optional runner address if you want to run it remotely, and then, do you want it to be privileged or not, right? There's all sorts of stuff that you can add on here that just makes the experience a little bit better. But what this particular action does is it's currently just basically parsing the earthly output to find an image or an artifact that was produced. Now, currently the way Catalyst CI was built was it expects one image per target, and that's just basically a requirement that I've built into it. It's definitely on my bucket list to go back and add support for multiple images, but for now, that's kind of what it does. And the way it fetches those images, and I don't know if you could see, so you can see like, it says image, blah, 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 output as CI/CLI latest. So you can see this is the actual action right here. So it's saying found image CI/CLI latest. And basically it's just parsing the log to get that. Now I know there's been some recent improvements to add some metadata to the images in one of the newer versions of Earthly. I haven't taken advantage of that feature yet. I just built it using basically a regular expression search. So I plan on going back and utilizing that at some point. But then it basically pulls that image out and then pushes it. Now the reason why we don't use earthly push is because there's additional steps that we want to do after earthly builds the image. For example, image scanning is a big one. The second one would be image signing. And so unfortunately, if you use, earthly -- push, it's going to push the image as soon as it's done building to the image registry. And there's really no way to do any post-processing on the image before it gets shipped to the registry. And I'm not sure if that's something, that's in the pipeline to improve, but what that means for us is that we can't utilize that feature. And so instead, what I do, like I said, is just basically parse the image name out, and then this next step that's been skipped because this is running on a PR, it's not actually merged to the main branch. But what the next step does is it basically just calls, Docker. Either it scans the image, and if everything passes, it basically just retags it and then pushes it using the local Docker daemon, instead of using earthly. And so I mean that's pretty much kind of it in a nutshell. Like I said, there's a lot more stuff I can go into detail. Like I said, I'll link the Catalyst CI repository. You're more than welcome to dig around into it. The actual workflows for like the CI and stuff are right here. So you can see if you want a good starting place would be ci.yaml, and you can kind of follow the trail from here to kind of see how it works at a high level. There's a lot of individual GitHub actions that were just written, like obviously discover action discovers stuff. The push action is, like I said, is what ultimately pushes the image to the repository. Setup deploy does setup does a lot of like initial setup. So and making sure that Earthly is installed, configuring the local instance of Earthly on the GitHub runner to have the right credentials, TLS credentials, to be able to connect to the remote runner, stuff like that. That's all kind of wrapped up here. And of course, everything has README, and if you click over here, there's documentation that will go very much in depth. Read the onboarding guide. It'll kind of go in depth with basically what I just explained, and then there's also reference documentation there that you can also consume. So I'm curious, to hear some feedback. If you guys have any feedback or what your thoughts are on this. Like I said, it's been a pretty big hit for us. The devs really like it. One of the things that I'm thinking about doing next that I kind of thought about a couple weeks ago was if you look at like an earth file. So what I realized is that, Earthly has this idea of docs or documentation, whatever you want to call it, which is basically just a comment that appears directly above a target name. And if you happen to be consuming the parser, you'll notice that like when it parses a target, it'll actually return a specific field for docs, which will basically just be the string contents of whatever comments happen to appear above that target. And so one of the improvements that I have in the pipeline is basically being able to configure the CI system using this documentation feature. And so what it would look like is, let's say, for example, this particular target is likely to run Docker and Docker, meaning it needs to run with the -p flag. Now, because the developer doesn't interact directly with the CI system, they don't necessarily get that flexibility to be able to say, hey, CI system, please only run this target in privilege mode. They sort of given up that control for the sake of simplicity. They don't have to worry about all those details. But sometimes it's nice to bring those knobs back down, especially in a controlled manner, to allow the developer to be able to say, hey, in this case, like, I want to be able to run in privilege mode. Or another example would be, please expect a secret, from this value or something like that, like pull in a secret from AWS. I don't know, anything like that, right? And so what that would look like is just, a comment with like, say, some sort of predetermined text like CI : and then like a space separated list of key value pairs is basically what I have in mind. And those key value pairs will be parsed by the CI. The CI will, you'll basically call the CI, give it an Earthly file and a target. It'll parse the docs and look for any, reference that has any line that starts with CI : and then it'll parse, the rest of that line just into key value pairs and then spit all that back out, so that when the CI is actually executing, it can basically talk to the developer in a way and get, their settings back and then actually do something with them. Like, again, for example, they might say CI : privilege equals true. And then the CI will make sure that when it executes Earthly, it passes the -p flag. So there's some more ideals here. And, I don't know if this is, like I said, something that that the Earthly team is thought of a way of using Earthly, and I'd certainly be interested in thoughts around potentially some like this ideal of configuring targets or allowing special syntax for sort of parsing or passing configuration data. I know our setup is definitely very unique, and so it may not be it may not fit everybody's mental model of what they expect Earthly to be used as. But like I said, it's been really great for us, and the developers really like it. So give me feedback. Otherwise, thanks for watching.